When the Nintendo Entertainment System came out in the 80s, it was the king of video games. At least in the United States it was. Nintendo was video games, and video games were Nintendo. Naturally, everybody expected a successor to this console, right? Well, not exactly. The idea of console generations wasn't quite established back then the way it is now, and especially in the minds of certain angry parents who saw the idea of the Super Nintendo as nothing more than a scam. Well, luckily Nintendo has a tendency of ignoring its fanbase, so ignoring a handful of angry parents was a no-brainer, and as a result we got what many consider to be one of, if not the greatest console ever made. But you know what else some people think is the greatest console ever made? That's right, the good old Nintendo Entertainment System. So what's going on here? Are these consoles friends or enemies? I mean, they're both from Nintendo. One of them just claims to be the super version of the other one. Fighting words to be sure. If somebody claiming to be the super retro bird came into my home, I'd be like, hey, screw you, buddy. In all honesty, I really don't see a ton of animosity amongst fans of the two consoles. Makes sense, since a ton of people who owned either one owned both. I mean, the primary candidates for people getting a Super Nintendo would have been people who had the previous Nintendo console. If you wanted to play the sequels or follow-ups to some of your favorite games on the NES, the Super Nintendo was the place to do it. Plus, looking at it nowadays, both consoles offer that old school 2D sprite-based style that so many of us retro gamers love. And yet, people do discern between the two. For example, some people just have a cutoff at the 16-bit generation for what they'll play, and the NES is just too old, probably in bed by 7:30 every night. Whether it's because people didn't grow up with the NES or they've simply never given it a fair shot, I don't know, but let me say this. I just cannot imagine somebody who enjoys the Super Nintendo not liking at least some of the games on the NES. Like, what fan of the Super Nintendo would tell you they don't enjoy Super Mario Bros. 3 if they like platformers? In fact, if they enjoyed it on the Mario All-Stars pack, it could be argued you caught them in a lie right there. All that being said, there are certain NES games that even the most die-hard fans of the console will say, yeah, the Super Nintendo equivalent is light years better. Super Metroid and A Link to the Past are two of the biggest examples that I see. I don't think this means the NES games should be bashed, but boy oh boy did the developers do those games justice with the follow-ups. All these years later, you still got some people saying those games are the best in their series. I've always thought of it like this. If the creators of those games were brilliant enough to come up with the original concepts for those games, it only makes sense that they would also be brilliant enough to build upon those concepts in a significant way, especially when considering they had new, more powerful hardware to work with. And here's the thing, a console generation leap meant a lot more back in those days. Over the years, we've gotten diminishing returns with each successive console generation to the point where we say, it kinda looks the same, whereas back then, whoa, now this is next gen. We're talking 16 bits here, folks. Nobody knew what it meant, but we sure could tell what it looked like. Okay, so the Super Nintendo was more powerful than the NES. That's to be expected. The NES can't help having been first and should get some credit for having laid the groundwork. I would never say, when I was a baby I walked like an idiot, but look at me now. The stride, the confidence, you can't beat it. And yet, most people would still prefer to be able to walk the way they do now as opposed to how they walked as a baby, right? So even though people give the NES a pass for having hardware appropriate for its time, they may very well still prefer the Super Nintendo, but not always, because the NES has a very iconic visual style, not to mention sound hardware, gameplay design tendencies, so on and so forth. Point is, there is a ton of subjectivity, and the comparison is nowhere near as simple as saying the Super Nintendo isn't as old, something that we as retro gamers should know better than anyone. If somebody told us that modern consoles are better than retro consoles simply because they're newer, we'd just laugh right in their face. Heck, might even laugh ourselves to death. Now, when it comes to differences between the two consoles, what exactly do we have going on? A lot of the same genres remained popular through the lifespan of both consoles, such as platformers, action platformers, beat-em-ups, and the like. All good stuff if you ask me. Well, perhaps the biggest difference might come from difficulty. It's not that the Super Nintendo didn't have its fair share of challenging games, but sound the difficulty alarm because the NES just cranked things up a notch with hard games that felt nearly sadistic in some cases. Who was ready for the turbo tunnel on their first try? Nobody, that's who. The NES has such a reputation for challenging games that it even coined the phrase NES hard. You ever hear somebody say, "Yo, this game is Wii hard"? I don't think so. The phrase NES hard is a badge of honor if you ask me, a feeling of mercilessness that takes gamers right back to how they felt playing certain games for the console. With such a reputation for difficulty, naturally people are going to have strong opinions one way or another. Either this is too hard, so screw it, a very popular reaction I've found, or on the flip side, the sense of challenge that creates great reward. Personally, I've been trying to beat Battletoads for a while, and every time I make it past the stage I haven't beaten before, it's extremely satisfying and fun too. That's the thing, I understand if not everybody wants that kind of challenge in their games, and since the Super Nintendo takes things down just a notch in general, while still remaining challenging, that may just be the sweet spot for a lot of gamers. Part of why NES games were so hard was not just the influence of arcade games at the time, but also to extend how much time you had to put into it before you could beat it. Nearly 30 years and counting for Battletoads, now there's some value. The Super Nintendo started to focus more on longer adventures, even more so than the rival Sega Genesis console, what with Sega's heavy arcade roots. This meant that games didn't have to be quite as challenging in order for gamers to get an appropriate amount of gameplay out of them. Quite a few games for Super Nintendo included save batteries, far more than the NES did, which also meant that the game didn't have to be short enough that you could realistically beat it in one sitting, or just leave your console on overnight. Mario 3, you son of an uncle. Not that games with save batteries weren't afraid to offer some challenge. For example, Final Fantasy VI is one of the longer games on the console, and I've still yet to beat the final boss. But even the easier games would often provide some additional value in other ways. For example, Super Mario World had a ton of secret exits for you to find that would take you to different paths and different stages. Alright, now let's talk about sound real quick. The NES has a very distinct sound style that people sometimes associate with chiptunes, although really the Game Boy is much more connected with that style. Either way, if you're a fan of the sound style found in NES games, you're not really going to find that on the Super Nintendo. What you will find is some of the most memorable and greatest pieces of video game music ever made. But really, that goes for both consoles. I'm going to chalk this one up to preference. A lot of great stuff to go around for everyone. Next up, we have controllers. The NES controller is a pretty solid entry with its simple and easy to use design. It's got one of the earliest and best implementations of Nintendo's famous cross D-pad, 2 red action buttons, a start button typically used for starting or pausing the game, and a select button for looking at. Yeah, it wasn't really used very much. The biggest complaint I tend to see about this controller is from people who say that the corners are too sharp. Now, if we take a close look at the corners here, we can see that they are technically rounded. So, not sure what the problem is. Maybe some people just grip the controller tight. Oh, you know what? I think I see the problem. If we jump on over to the Super Nintendo controller, you can see that Nintendo addressed the possible issue of the corners being too sharp. Trust me, I've been on this earth long enough to feel confident calling something round, and sweet doggy, those are some round corners. The D-pad is arguably even better here, and now we have 2 shoulder buttons in addition to 2 more additional face buttons, and don't forget the start and select buttons. Good gravy, we're practically swimming in buttons here, folks. Most games didn't really use all of the buttons, but it was still nice to have the option, and it ended up really saving the day when the Street Fighter II craze swept in. What's your answer for that, Sega? Oh, that's actually pretty darn good. With the NES controller transitioning to the Super Nintendo controller, what we have again is a case of the Super Nintendo benefiting from getting to build off of the NES. Nobody holds it against the NES for being first, and if anything, they give it a ton of credit. To me, one of the biggest questions questions when it comes to comparing the NES to the Super Nintendo has always been how important is it versus how good is it? Not that the NES isn't good, but its importance is undoubtedly a massive part of what it gets credit for, and deservedly so. We all know how people like to give it credit for saving the video game industry in the US, and what could be more important than that? Can you just imagine how terrible life would be if we never got things like the Xbox One X? Yeah, I generally see more people saying that they like the Super Nintendo more than the regular Nintendo, but certainly not everybody, and it's usually not with any sort of contempt either way. The NES was so pivotal in what the Super Nintendo would become that they've never been pitted as rivals to each other. That was the Sega Genesis's job. Alright, but with all of that said, I do still want to know which console you prefer and how you would personally compare the two. Like I said before, Super Nintendo generally wins any sort of poll like this, but it would be interesting to know where my viewers stand and what your reasoning for it is. I'm in the Super Nintendo camp myself, but still play the NES quite a bit and really enjoy it. Okay, so with that, be sure to leave your answers down below, and I will see ya in the next video.
He's the retro bird, yeah, and he's talking about video games. He's the